Hello there, American Cultures friends. Miss Danfout here. Now, I know I'm not John Green in his fantastic videos that you typically watch for Crash Course, but today we're going to talk about Pearl Harbor. So what happened on the day of Pearl Harbor? We're about to find out if you don't already know. What you should have in front of you is this paper right here. I want you to look at the top, right above that picture. I'm just going to read that out loud for you. It says, the attack on Pearl Harbor happened when? December 7th, 1941. So just a few days ago, Japanese airplanes made a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy in Pearl Harbor. They destroyed many ships and killed many soldiers. It was this attack that forced the United States to enter World War II. As you already know, since that's where we ended yesterday. So going on to the next one. Where the heck is Pearl Harbor even located? Well, Pearl Harbor is located in Hawaii, if you didn't know that already, on the island of Oahu. Okay, not the biggest island, but one of those sort of in the middle. It's located in the Pacific Ocean between California, so think West Coast, and Japan. During the time of World War II, Hawaii was not a state, it was just a U.S. territory. So we did have our Navy station there, our Navy base, okay, as you remember from talking about imperialism, hopefully, but it hadn't become a state yet, okay, that was more about around the 1950s. Alright, so before the attack, we can't just jump right into the attack. We need to talk about what caused this attack to really happen. What was going on before? So World War II had been raging in Europe and Asia for 2 years now. Okay, we, like many wars, did not enter right away. The United States had not entered, like I said. The Empire of Japan was trying to take over much of Asia. You learned that yesterday as you colored your map. A lot of that map was colored red, blue, whatever color you chose, in favor of Japan taking it over. Okay, they were worried that the U.S. Navy in Hawaii would try to stop them. So they decided to strike in order to prevent the United States from attacking them. You know, good thinking, right? Not really. So the Japanese thought if they took out the warships in Pearl Harbor, because that was one of our biggest Navy bases at the time, then the United States Navy would be crippled. Okay, so it would be broken. We wouldn't have the ships and the resources that we needed in order to fight Japan. And then we would never attack. However, they were mistaken, as you well know. And the attack on Pearl Harbor had actually the opposite result. Okay, the people were so upset and maddened about what Japan did, about that surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, that we declared war on them the very next day. It did not take very much time at all. And it also became known as the day that will live in infamy. So let's talk about the attack itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise. No idea, okay? At least the people in Pearl Harbor had no idea that they would be attacked on that Sunday morning. Hundreds of Japanese fighter planes and bombers flew to Pearl Harbor in the morning. The bombers dropped bombs and torpedoes on the warships, while the fighter planes attacked the U.S. fighter planes on the ground, so they could not take off and fight back. So if you remember the clip from the movie Pearl Harbor that you watched yesterday, it shows those two fighter pilots trying to get to a plane that hadn't been destroyed. It was very difficult because the Japanese really thought it out. While they're bombing these ships, they're also bombing the airfield. So how could we ever possibly fight them back on that day? There were 2 waves of attacks. By the end of the second wave, a number of U.S. ships were destroyed. So not only was there one wave where it was total destruction, just a few minutes later, there was a second. So kind of like what happened with 9/11. One plane, thought that would be the end, and then here comes the second. Seems to be the thing that keeps repeating in history. All right, the numbers. So let's talk about casualties and injured. The casualties from both sides during the attack, you can see on this paper that you have in front of you. You have the United States and you have Japan here. Okay, so after the Japanese inflicted considerable damage to the United States Navy, they did not cripple it. So they didn't do exactly what they had planned to do. The United States was still okay to go into war the very next day. They damaged many ships, including warships, destroyers, and cruisers. They also destroyed a lot of the fighter planes and aircrafts at the base. However, all of the U.S. ships but 3, the Arizona, the Utah, and the Oklahoma, were able to be recovered and used later during the war. That was not the plan that the Japanese had in mind. They wanted to destroy and sink as many ships as possible, and luckily, only 3 were rendered incapable of repair. The biggest U.S. loss was the sinking of the USS Arizona. Over 1,100 U.S. military personnel died when the Arizona sunk. So a lot of people got trapped inside. The ship sunk so quickly that people who were outside trying to get them out were not able to do it fast enough. Remember, this was back in 1941. We didn't have the technology that we have today. So a lot of people died, and there is now the ship in Pearl Harbor remains where it sank because it's considered a tomb to those 1,100 U.S. military soldiers. Very sad. So if you just take a second and look at the little chart that you have here, United States, Japan, many people killed under the United States. Okay, not as many for Japan. They kind of made out with that one. People wounded, same with the United States, a lot of people, and it was really unknown how many were wounded with Japan, because if they were able to get away, then who knows if they were actually wounded or if they were not wounded. I'm not going to read down the list completely, but you can definitely see that the United States was hurt much more than Japan was, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that it was a surprise, and Japan knew it was coming. After the attack, the citizens of the U.S. were in shock. Because it was a surprise, this was one of the first kinds of attacks that the United States had experienced where they were attacked by surprise. Typically, we would know if something like that was going to happen or occur, but in this case, we didn't. So they had tried to avoid the war, but they couldn't ignore the attack. Too many lives were lost, too many people were wounded, too many families were affected. So the Japanese, like I had said before, hoped to break the Americans by attacking Pearl Harbor, but instead they united them. Just like after 9/11, America became united. That's not what Al-Qaeda wanted, but it's what happened. The next day, December 8th, the U.S. declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States. So remember that alliance system that goes on in every war that's ever existed. And the United States was now a big part of World War II. The U.S. Navy was able to recover from the attack on Pearl Harbor fairly quickly. Okay, the Japanese had not damaged a number of important facilities on the Hawaiian Islands, including oil storage depots and repair yards. Also, no aircraft carriers were in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. Aircraft carriers would soon become the most important type of Navy vessels in the war. So the good thing about when Japan chose to attack Pearl Harbor is that only about half the fleet was in the harbor at the time. The damage could have been much bigger had more of the ships been docked there at the time. So that is one thing that was on the United States side. Speaking of that memorial that I mentioned earlier, there is a memorial to the United States soldiers who lost their lives during the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's called the USS Arizona Memorial, and is built on the water above the wreckage of the USS Arizona. It's considered a U.S. National Historic Landmark. I can personally say that I have been to Hawaii. I've been to Pearl Harbor Memorial 2 times, and it is one of the saddest, most quiet places I've probably ever been. There's a wall that has every name of every life that was lost during the attacks. Typically when you enter Hawaii, you're given a lei around your neck. A lot of people like to take it and drop it into the water above the USS Arizona as a way to pay your respects. So it's very somber and very sad, but definitely an experience that you should try or go to if you're able to ever get to Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Just some interesting facts for you to know, because I think John Green does that too. The Japanese reportedly had intended to declare war prior to the attack. However, the message never got to the president. What are the odds of that? Very weird. President Roosevelt gave a famous speech after the attack on which he said December 7th would be a day which would live in infamy, never to be forgotten. Every president since Franklin D. Roosevelt has visited the USS Arizona Memorial, so that's nice to know. Maybe they've dropped the leis into the water as well. Japanese also used submarines, including smaller ones called midget submarines, in the attack. So it's not very often that you hear about these submarines being used. You typically think of those kamikaze pilots being the ones who were involved in the attack, but apparently there were more than just the pilots. The entire attack lasted around 110 minutes. So that's just under 2 hours. That is a long time. That is a long time to be taking such gunfire and destruction. Very long. Non-stop. The Japanese attacked on a Sunday morning, like I mentioned earlier, because they thought the U.S. soldiers would be less alert at that time. Were they right? Yeah. A lot of people were just getting in from a night out. A lot of people were still sleeping. This was like 8 o'clock in the morning. They were not prepared whatsoever. Were they able to quickly become prepared if they weren't killed in the process? Yeah, I mean, that's what they're trained for. But unfortunately, Japan definitely had the right idea when they decided to attack on a Sunday. All right, so now that you have learned all about the attacks on Pearl Harbor, I want you to just pick out the most surprising detail that you've learned through that paper, the thing that surprises you the most, and I want you to comment on Google Classroom under just the agenda like you normally do, and just say why you were surprised at that the most. Okay, so say what you were surprised at with all the facts that you learned from this discussion, from this packet right here, and then why. And then once you've done that, there are some accounts that I would love for you to read or take a look at before viewing the Pearl Harbor video. All right, enjoy. Ms. Danfelt signing off.